Way.
No sign of foul play at this point.
We weren't looking. We were concerned.
I mean, there was no foul play in her room.
Taking our cue from the previous analysis where John seems to be crystal clear 28 years later of the obvious signs of an intruder in the basement, the open window, the broken window, the suitcase that didn't belong, well, another obvious question arises. After they found the ransom note, when they searched for JonBenet, did John go down into the basement? Did anyone go down into the basement? Or did they accept what was in the note at face value, call the cops, call their friends, and not really search for JonBenet beyond her bedroom? But who would do that, and who wouldn't search the whole house? Interestingly, in his own narrative of the incident, it takes John until page 20 of their book, The Death of Innocence, to remember to look in the basement, which he apparently does at an undisclosed time when the house is conveniently a zoo filled with people and the cops can't keep track of everyone, including John. He writes, "I think about the basement now. I jump up and hurry down there." Curiously, he seems to do this, he seems to go there without telling anyone.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Now let's resume our analysis of the Larry King interview, heading to the 10-minute mark where we left off in our previous analysis. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Incidentally, the analytics of this channel show that almost 2/3 of you are not subscribed. You'd really be doing me a favor if a few of you do subscribe and get me to that 200,000 threshold, subscriber threshold. Also, if you are interested in the Ramsey case, I'm going to be sharing with you a fascinating Boulder Police Department bulletin. I think it's number 44. That gives you really interesting kind of on-the-ground updates, what was going on just a couple of months after the incident, according to Boulder PD, giving their side of the story as this whole case was evolving. This is really going to blow your mind. Besides that, we'll also be examining Linda Arndt's 34-page police report. She actually wrote 2 reports, one dealing with the day after Christmas and another one, I think 19 pages, dealing with her time spent with the Ramseys, I think the next day. And so based on how the 34-page report is received, I might do that one as well. So look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, interesting, you're learning something, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. Number 1, instinctive reaction.
Child, I loved her.
Instinctive reaction.
Where were you?
Let's listen to that again.
Child, I loved her.
Instinctive reaction.
Where were you?
While John is smiling broadly, explaining why he didn't call an officer when he found JonBenet, and this had to have been a traumatic moment, I don't really know why he's smiling, Patsy jumps in to rescue John, saying, instinctive reaction. Think about those words. I can't help thinking Patsy is 100% correct. Regardless of what really happened that night, I think Patsy likely felt whatever she did, whether she wrote the note or not, whatever happened, she was acting out of instinct. Perhaps a mother's instinct, perhaps a wife's instinct, perhaps both. Perhaps a pageant queen's as well. Think about a pageant queen's instinctive reactions. What would they be in a situation like this? What could they be? And that brings us to number 2. You told Patsy, meaning, John, you told Patsy that JonBenet died, right? You'd expect that to happen at some point. You've got the parents in the house, and Burke is no longer in the house at this point. You told Patsy, didn't you? Didn't you?
You told Patsy?
I don't remember the sequence.
This is another all-time whopper. John has just found his little girl deceased. It's got to be a experience that is burned into his heart, burned into his mind. And certainly in this version of events, he can't remember whether he told Patsy. And I don't know about you, but someone very close to me died, and I remember exactly how I found out about it and who I spoke to, and I remember that like it happened 10 seconds ago. This is another great question from Larry. When does the little girl's father, John, tell the little girl's mother, Patsy, his wife, that JonBenet is gone, that she's died, and how he found her and what he thinks and all that kind of thing, and comforting her and her comforting him? One can imagine this to be a terrible, horrible, but nevertheless memorable milestone. So when does John tell Patsy? When do they tell Burke? Now, obviously, if there was no intruder, there would be no moment to tell anyone anything because it was self-evident, which means that moment has to be invented again if there was no intruder. The tricky part is, if there was no intruder, then John and Patsy have to agree where and when this happened, where in the house, when, and what they said. So, can John remember this seminal event, telling Patsy the little girl was no more? What does he say?
Where were you, Patsy?
I was upstairs with
You
Ramsey.
told Patsy?
I don't remember the sequence.
Is that a reasonable statement under these circumstances? Because oddly enough, Linda Arndt tells John that JonBenet is no longer alive. Doesn't John tell anyone?
And I see John Ramsey carrying JonBenet up the last 3 steps from the basement. And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while. I ordered him to put JonBenet down. I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite me. And his face was just inches from mine. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget.
So it's quite interesting how accurately Detective Linda Arndt remembers this, whereas John can't even remember telling Patsy. Number 3, it all happened so fast.
No, because usually...
It all happened so fast.
I found my...
That's another helpful voluntary insertion from Patsy. Patsy volunteers this while John is scrambling to explain himself. One can't help thinking, if the intruder narrative was real, then it would be the opposite. Time would slow to a crawl. You'd be watching the second hand of the clock inexorably ticking, like you may remember when you were a kid at school, waiting for the end of the class. You just can't get that clock to tick fast enough. In terms of getting the intruder to call, you'd have the same sort of thing, this agonizing, excruciating, slow motion event taking place. And what are they waiting for? Well, 10 a.m., the time for the intruder to call, would drag, right? And at this point, it's, what time is it? 7 a.m., 6 a.m. It's going to be 3 hours of waiting to find out what is going on with JonBenet. Just in terms of this whole idea of did it really all happen so fast? And maybe it's unfair. Maybe you can say, well, in the context was when John found her. I'm just saying, in an intruder narrative situation, it didn't happen very quickly at all. And in fact, this entire case hasn't happened very quickly at all. Everything is dragged in terms of this. The ransom note wasn't written very quickly at all either. But what if Patsy and John and Burke did hear a scream that night? Let's say at 2 o'clock in the morning, then you could imagine it all happened so fast. If you need to scramble to do something. And so one wonders, just in terms of that statement, how is it true? In what ways could it be true? What, pray tell, was fast about finding a note and waiting all morning for JonBenet to be found 7 hours later? What, pray tell, was fast about finding oneself in a situation in the middle of the night? Well, that would have been a different story. Number 4, did you try to do anything to revive her? Now, interestingly, when Chris Watts first gave his version of events, he was also asked, well, did you do anything to revive her? And he was kind of thrown by that, because anyone in that reality would do that. And I think Linda Arndt did that herself. She moved her face right to JonBenet's face.
I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face.
Now, when you juxtapose Linda Arndt's reaction to finding JonBenet, she goes straight to the little girl's face, and you juxtapose that to John's response, it's quite different. Also, in Lawrence Schiller's book, he describes JonBenet having blue lips. It was very clear that she was no longer alive.
And thank God I found her.
Did you try anything to revive her?
I took the tape off her mouth. I tried to untie her arms.
John doesn't mention that there was mucus coming out of her nose. He doesn't mention that there was a slight whiff, a slight smell, and he doesn't mention anything about her breathing and sort of really paying attention to her face. If you think about it, he's more concerned about all of the pageantry around it, the duct tape, the other things, right? But this is also another fantastic question from Larry. Now think about what John has said. When asked if he knew she was dead, he said no.
I found her.
Did you know she was dead?
No, I didn't. I had this rush of...
And how does Linda Arndt respond to the same question?
And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while.
Now, who's right? Whose perception is better? Something else that's quite interesting is John said that she was cool to the touch, whereas Fleet White actually touched JonBenet's feet in the basement and said they were dead cold. The other thing that we know is that food was found in JonBenet's stomach, and that suggests that she died shortly after eating that food, which also means that she'd been dead for a while. So does the evidence support Linda Arndt's observations or John Ramsey's observations? Who do you believe? Now, the flip side of this argument is if John didn't know JonBenet was dead, like Arndt did know, but if John didn't know, wouldn't the first logical, obvious, instinctual thing be to call her name? Check for her pulse, try and get her attention, try and rouse her, check whether she was breathing, try to revive her, do CPR. What do you think the answer is? John doesn't answer the question because he says he does other things, for example, removing the duct tape. But does he ever try to revive her? Number 5, they were very tightly bound.
They were very tightly bound. I couldn't get the knot undone.
Now, this whole idea of very tightly bound and duct tape kind of makes you think, wow, you're really dealing with some kind of monstrous predator, right? Very tightly bound. JonBenet's wrist must have hurt because of this. But in this instance, I'm going to refer to the text of the autopsy report. Does it agree that JonBenet's wrists were very tightly bound? Well, here's an excerpt. Tied loosely around the right wrist, overlying the sleeve of the shirt is a white cord. So we have two things here. First of all, tied loosely, not very tightly bound. John doesn't say tightly bound, he says very tightly bound. Well, the autopsy report says tied loosely, and not only is it tied loosely, it's around the outside of the sleeve. So what's going on here? I mean, it doesn't actually seem like this cord had any function. It seems like it's loosely there and it's not really restraining JonBenet really in any way. So are we dealing with some kind of really dark, brutal predator with horrible ambitions, or are we dealing with something else? I'm not going to take it further than that, except that I want to confirm how and where we know about that fingerprint mentioned in the last analysis. It is important, if you're going to make a claim like that, to say, well, how do you know that? Where do you get that from? What is your source? Now, before I reveal the source, anyone know off the top of their heads how we know it was John's fingerprint on the basement window? Where does the information come from? Is it important to know where it comes from? Or is it sufficient just to say that we're pretty sure that there was a fingerprint and that it was John's? Well, here's the source. Kolar's book, Foreign Faction, page 226, second paragraph. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.